How are you? Thank you so much for coming. Just got a greeting from an old friend. Chandler, how are you? Glad to see everybody here. Thank you so much for joining me today. As always, just go ahead and throw any questions in the chat that you might have. I'm going to keep my eye on it until Corey gets here to man the chat. We should be expecting him to walk through the door or pop in here just in a few minutes. So, yeah, excited to go through what we have today. Got a lot of exciting things to share with everybody, but let's go ahead and get started, all right? Everyone's excited? I'm excited. Here we go. Yes. So we are going to be talking about mastering today, and mastering is something that a lot of people don't know much about. I mean, a lot of us master our own music. We master our own projects. We, depending on where you are in the spectrum of that project, right? You could be a producer that's doing your own mixing and mastering. You may be mixing only and then mastering as a sort of an extra part of that. Maybe they don't have a separate mastering engineer, which I find myself being in that sort of scenario a lot of the times. And then there's the situation like what we're going to be looking at today, where someone like myself is just mastering a song that was mixed by somebody else. And this is a very common thing. You know, the whole world of mastering engineers are basically people that do just that. A lot of them don't do mixing. A lot of them don't do producing. They just master. So what we're going to be looking at today is a song that was produced and written by a band from Ecuador named Barro. And let me go ahead and show you all my, let's go ahead and take a look at their page here really quick. See, that's their Spotify. Check them out. They're doing very well. Very, very popular group from Ecuador. Really talented. Just their music is it's just on point. I mean, what else can I say? It's not, you just got to listen to it. They're just good, you know. And if you ever get a chance to check out one of their shows, you'll definitely be in for a treat. So yeah, that's Barro. They're awesome. I love working with them. I've been working with them for a bit, actually, for a couple of years now. Done a lot of mastering for them. So the lead singer, Jose Villa is what he goes by. You can find him on Instagram. But he mixed this. He's a great mix engineer as well as a great writer, great guitarist, great singer, like kind of everything. He's a quadruple threat. Yeah, we basically do a lot of work together. I do a lot of his mastering. So he mixed it. Like I said, he's a singer, he's a producer, writer. So he kind of does it all. But yeah, so I mastered this for him last week, and we're going to break down how we did the mastering and all of that great stuff. So questions, definitely throw them in the chat. And and I appreciate that for the person who just said they finally were able to make it tonight. Yeah, questions in the chat. Anything you can think of, we'll address it at some point tonight. And that's it. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the session. Okay, so we're looking here at my Ableton session. And we have, for those of you that are not familiar with Ableton Live, just kind of give you a quick little breakdown here. When I click on things like the track, or if I'm on the master channel down here, we see the signal flow of our inserts from left to right, okay? It's not like Logic where you see things from top down, or Pro Tools like that, or Studio One. I feel like every DAW basically is like from the top down. Maybe not Reaper, if you're familiar with Reaper, but this is what Ableton Live looks like on each channel. So we're going to go over what I did on this. But what I would like to do first is, before I even talk about the session, I'd like to listen to the song. So I guess this is sort of like a sneak preview, and I didn't necessarily ask for clearance from the band, but that's okay because it's just us right now. So I think we're going to be okay. I do have a question here in the chat. How much to get me to switch DAWs? I don't know. Ableton, I mean, you're even going to see tonight in some of the stuff that I'm doing, some of the advantages of Ableton in terms of creative, uses and parallel processing and things like that. Definitely not to the full extent of why I use Ableton, but partly. So Ableton is absolutely fire. So yeah, let's go ahead and take a listen to the song. So the song is called Boca a Boca, and it is by Barro. And let's take a listen to it from beginning to end. Here we go.
Hace mucho tiempo que no te veo, me siento solo en la ciudad. Ya no sé ni quién soy, no tengo ubicación. Bailando boca a boca, bailando boca a boca, ella me lo da, el beso me lo da. Ella siempre me provoca, un beso en su boca, pero ya no está, ella ya no está. Oye nena, mira tu piel canela, ese beso está siempre latiendo en mi cabeza. Tú sé que me mareas, como quisiera que volvieras. Extraño contigo cenar, cuando reías me hacías volar. Nunca pensé que esto iba a terminar, como quisiera volver a empezar. ¿Lo intentamos? Bailando boca a boca, bailando boca a boca, ella me lo da, el beso me lo da. Ella siempre me provoca, un beso en su boca, pero ya no está, ella ya no está. Bailando boca a boca, yo te como a esos, no hay de qué escondernos. Yo te como a esos, cuando caímos una vez, me ayudaste a estar de pie. Caímos otra vez, yo sí que lo intenté, y así pasó una y otra vez. Se hizo habitual, que no supe ver mi mal, equivocarme fue brutal. Bailando boca a boca, bailando boca a boca, ella me lo da, el beso me lo da. Ella siempre me provoca, un beso en su boca, pero ya no está, ella ya no está. Bailando boca a boca, yo te como a esos, no hay de qué escondernos. Yo te como a esos,
Yo te como a besos.
sigo preocupado, no despierto, me siento solo en la ciudad. Y ya no sé ni quién soy, no siento ni dolor, no tengo ubicación, ya pasé lo peor. Parece que fue ayer, ella tuvo que saber que no voy a volver, no dudo que la amé. Ay, que no me digas, ay, que no me digas tú todo lo que vales, tú lo que vales. Ay, que no me digas, ay, que no me digas tú todo lo que vales, tú. Bailando boca a boca, bailando boca a boca, ella me lo da, el beso me lo da. Ella siempre me provoca, un beso en su boca, pero ya no está, ella ya no está.
Yo te como a besos.
Nice. Beautiful. So yeah, that's the song you're hearing. You're the first besides the artist himself to hear the master. And it was a lot of fun to work on. Now this project is what I like about this project, what I like about working with this band in general, and what we sometimes have this misconception of mastering. Oh, by the way, I want to ask, there was a couple of comments in there about about the mix and everything. I just want to clarify that the lead singer did mix this song. So yeah, he's very talented. I hope everybody enjoyed it. So yeah, the thing with working with this band is that they're very particular about the product being very close to the mix, if that makes sense. So there's a misconception about mastering that we are sort of just changing the game with what we're sent in terms of the mix. And if you think about, like, if you're mixing your own stuff and you're mastering your own stuff, right? Mastering at that point is just kind of the extra sauce at the end. Maybe some extra limiting, making sure it's loud enough. You might find that a cool EQ on there sounds kind of nice in the signal chain. And that's really all it is. It doesn't have to be more than that, right? There are situations where I get music sent to me that needs a little love, okay? Or maybe the mix is great, but there's a certain texture they're going for that I can get via the limiting and things like that. Oh, look, everybody, it's Corey. Say hi. Hi, Corey. He's going to jump on the chat and help me out at some point here. So, but yeah, so, a lot of the times, depending on the type of what people want from mastering, right, that can change. So just understand that mastering is never just one thing. It can be many, many things. And we haven't even touched on things like quality control and noise reduction and stuff like that. But so this particular, what I mentioned was that I love working with this band because they really want to preserve the sound of the mix. They don't want to necessarily change the mix much. At least what we have to understand is that when we make things louder, when we do our limiting and we do master processing, it is going to change the sound. So there has to be an understanding that the sound is going to change to a certain extent, right? But how that changes, right? What can we preserve from the vibe of the mix? Okay, and that's a lot of the times my job. And with these particular, or with this band, that is one of the big sort of points for them that they really want preserved from the mix is like, please maintain the vibe. I don't want it to be that much brighter or have that much bass or crazy wide different than what they had in the mix. So I'm going to show you how we achieve that today. Now another thing I'm going to show you is how the mastering compares to the pre-master, and that's a really important thing for you to hear because you're going to notice that there's differences, but there's also similarities, and honestly that's a challenge. The challenge in these types of projects is making something sound similar while trying to achieve that loudness, while trying to achieve what I want to hear in the mastering. Okay, so what I want to do is, and also if there's questions about I'll touch on LUFS and all of that, like the loudness stuff. We have lots of time to go through those things, but if you do have any specific questions, I'll keep my eye on things so that way we can address them. But I think what we should start off with is actually listening to the pre-master briefly. We'll just listen to a portion of it, and then we'll go to the master and then hear the difference. Now, one thing that is much different between the two is the loudness. And if you look on my session here, let me go ahead and jump to that way you can see what's going on. If I zoom in here on this very last plugin, it's actually not turned on right now. It's actually a gain plugin, because if we look here, see it says -8 right there. This master is actually -8 dB louder than the pre-master, which is substantial. And actually the original pre-master is up here at the top of the session, and part of my workflow is to make sure that from time to time I'm listening to the pre-master, and that's what I have happening here. Okay, so the pre-master is not, and something that you have to understand is if you want to do this, you have to make sure that the pre-master is not going through your master processing, right? I have all of this EQ and compression and limiting and things like that going through here. I don't want the pre-master going through that because I'm not going to be able to hear what the original pre-master sounded like, right? So I would either have to bypass everything before listening to the pre-master, or what Ableton allows me to do is and I should keep a little tally at the top of the screen, like how many points Ableton gets during these streams, but Ableton gets a point for allowing me to route to this here. If you look at this output, for those of you not familiar with Ableton, this is like, basically the routing section. This is the channel strip. There's my mute, there's my fader, there's my pan, there's my solo record arm. Those are my sends, all that stuff. But here's my routing. You can see it says external out. And if we look at the actual track that's being processed through the mastering, it's going to the master channel. Okay, so by going to the external out, it allows me to hear the pre-master unaffected by the master processing. Okay, now we'll get more into that, or if anyone has questions on that, let me know. I do see a question in the chat. Let's check it out. So the question is, if a mix is already pretty good, do you typically not do much to it? Excellent question. I feel like it would be a situational thing. Absolutely. As I said, we get some mixes that need a little bit of love or just simply need the enhancement that people kind of expect from the mastering. Whereas, in this case, and in many cases, I get great mixes. But something that we're going to see, and what's interesting to understand, is that loudness changes the game. It's not just about, hey, let me put that limiter on, let me get the loudness that I want, and then boom, we have it. It's done. It's mastered. No. Many times, I have to do more work to make something sound better, louder, simply because we're adding limiting, simply because we're adding the processing that we need in order to achieve a certain output volume. So great question. Does it make our job easier? Absolutely. I had to do a project where I mastered 10 songs in just a couple hours. And the reason why, and that, to put it in a perspective, I could spend a couple hours on one song, but I was able to do 10 songs because the mixes were that good. It was a very easy process, and that is just something that we can always shoot for. Now, let's go back to what I was talking about with the pre-master and the master. So the reason why I have this plugin on here after everything that I'm doing in my mastering is because I actually put this on here so I can bring the volume down of the master. Here, let me just, here we go. So that way I can bring down the volume of the master in order for me to have a fair comparison with the pre-master. Okay, the pre-master being quieter and the master being louder automatically changes our perspective. If something is louder than something else, whether it's a kick drum or whether it's a whole track, you are immediately going to be biased towards the louder sound. The louder sound is not a fair playing field. So we have to gain match what we're mastering, the louder thing, to the pre-master, which is the quieter thing, in order to really hear if we're maintaining the vibe between the two, or whatever it is that we're trying to maintain. It could be the punch of the drums or the high end or whatever that may be. So that's the reason why this plugin is here. It's to simply gain match and give me a level playing field. So this guy right here, it's the only reason I have this on here is to have that level playing field of comparison. And then I'm going to bypass that because I don't want my master to be 8 dB quieter when I send it to the client. So this is just for the sake of this comparison that we're about to do, okay? So let's take a listen. So this is the master with this plugin on, okay? Again, it's going to be quieter. So through the stream, we're going to hear it as such, as slightly quieter. So let's hear the master. Okay, and then here's the pre-master. Here's the master. Okay, let me jump to the end here. Okay, here's the pre-master. Here's the master. Pre-master. So we can hear differences, and I think to most of you, you can hear that there is a difference between the pre-master and the master. How do you describe it? Well, that is a lot of what the processing is doing. There's what I like to call artifacts, or sort of the consequences of loudness, which is part of it. And then there's quality things that we do in order to ensure that when we take this anywhere, whether it's in a pair of nice headphones, whether it's on a set of nice monitors, whether it's on some really crappy car system, we want that to translate, and some of the decisions are made in order to make that happen. And then there's things that we do to potentially help the mix a little bit. So we have many factors there, right? We have achieving loudness, we have quality control, which is kind of where I categorize things like translation, so it sounds good everywhere. And then we also have these things like, the low mid sounds slightly muddy, so let me go ahead and touch that up a little bit just for the sake of clarity. So all three of those things are potentials for what we address in mastering. We got another question here. Give me a second. Yep, I see that. So what dictates whether you master a song with stems? Nice. Or an entire track. So stem mastering versus stereo mastering. And is that particular to this song, or is it up to the client? That's a great question. Yeah, it's sort of a conversation that you have with the producer, the artist, the client, what have you, in order to determine what is needed to get the best possible result. Now with Jose, with the lead singer of the band, he generally gives me exactly what I need, and I think that's because he understands. And I think there's an understanding between him and I that, okay, I'm only going to do so much. What I have to do, the minimum that I have to do to get this to the loudness we need and to slightly improve on it, because we've been through this. We've mastered a lot of music together. And I kind of, in the beginning, when I was first starting, I was kind of just doing my thing. I was trying to make everything, I was enhancing everything and trying to do what I may have to do on other projects, but it was immediately, his response was immediately, let's try to pull that back a little bit. So once there was that understanding, I think we realized that, what he gives me is generally what is needed. So the stereo mix is fine. Now, if there is something that I hear, like if I think, the drums could just punch slightly a little bit more, and I'm having a hard time making that happen with the tools that I'm using, I may ask him for a mix without the drums and then a separate drum stem to give me that extra control. So that is something that is, a possibility. I have clients where their mixing they're really good at mixing, but they know that there's a couple details that I could probably adjust in the stems. And for those of you that aren't clear on what I mean when I say stems have many definitions, but in this case we're talking about groups of instruments. So I get a single file that is all the drums as one stereo file. I get all the bass sounds, we'll say, for example, as another stereo file, and then they'll give me all the synths as a stereo mix as one file, and kind of all the instrument groups broken down, and then they'll potentially give me all the lead vocals as a stem, all the background vocals as a stem. So I might end up working with anywhere between 4 to, even less. Sometimes it's only an a cappella and an instrumental. But that is just a case-by-case basis. And yeah, great question, because every project is different. In fact, Corey and I were mastering a project where, you can check it out on Spotify. It's Johnny Badluck, 12 songs. Every single project, we had the kick drum as a separate stem, isolated from all the drums, simply because by that genre, we find that boosting the kick a little bit in the mastering can be a big help. And it's not always the case in every rap project. That's the thing. It's so case by case, or what you said, situational. So yeah, awesome, great question. So yeah, and as I was saying, this project here in particular is one of those where we try not to change a whole lot. So what are we hearing, right? What are the differences that we hear? Well, there's definitely differences in width, okay, the wideness that we hear. There's differences in frequency response. It was actually a little brighter than I anticipated when I just did that A/B comparison, but it's fine because he gave the thumbs up. I will share. There's one extra thing that we're going to be doing to this project. More on that. But we're just going to talk about right now. He has approved this. This has been an approved master, but we are going to try one more thing on this just because he wants to, for experimentation reasons. So we have width, we have frequency response difference, the difference in the limiting, the compression, that might be what you're hearing as a difference in the punch of the drums. I am curious, for those of you that were listening, what differences you heard. Okay, so was it a good difference, a bad difference? But let's talk about how we arrived at that. Okay, first, what I want to do, and we might work our way backwards here. We're going to start with what the loudness is. What's the output that we're going for here? This is kind of the technical, or one, I should say, of the technical aspects of mastering. So let's look at this meter here. I'm using Isotope's Insight 2, and this is going to display a couple important things that we look at in mastering. Okay, one of them is called LUFS, or loudness units full scale. We have two values, at least that I look at. Every mastering engineer is different, but for me, I'm looking at both at the integrated LUFS and the short-term LUFS. And then the last thing that I'm looking at is this value here called true peak. So true peak, short-term LUFS, and integrated LUFS. Okay, so let me just play a segment of the song of the master. Watch your volume, by the way, because I did take that plugin off, so we are 8 dB louder. And let's take a look at these meters while this is playing.
Un beso me lo da, ella siempre me provoca. Un beso en su boca, pero ya no está. Ella ya no está. Bailando boca a boca. Yo te como a esos, no hay de qué escondernos. Yo te como a esos, cuando caímos una vez.
Okay, so as you were watching, you saw the number like -8, -7 pop up. These two values are different because integrated is measuring from the moment I hit play to the moment I hit stop. So if I played this through the whole song from beginning to end, this value is actually going to be different than what we would see from what I just did, right? Where I was just playing a few seconds. Short term is a predetermined amount of time. I actually am not 100% sure what that amount of time is. It's probably a matter of seconds, but I look at it as integrated as the whole song. Short term could be like the chorus, you know? So I personally look more at short term because I might be measuring the loudness of just the chorus, or maybe going to the loudest portion of the production in order to determine really what the, you know, because if my verse sounds good and my chorus sounds good and they sound good going from one to another, I'm not worried about the loudness of the verse, but I am curious about the loudest section of the track to kind of get a feel of how this is going to stack up compared to other things out there. Now we do have a question in the chat. By the way, I really appreciate the questions because that keeps things interesting for us. Does the standard for LUFS levels change from genre to genre? And that's a great, or vary from genre to genre. That's a great question. That's actually a good segue into what I was just about to mention, which is, you know, why LUFS, right? There's other things that we've looked at in the past. For those of you that are just learning this stuff, you have to understand that, like, how do you gauge how loud something is? Like, how do I do that? How do I know that my track here is going to be as loud as, I don't know, if I think of a Latin artist like Alejandro Sanz or someone that's a big artist, right? Oh, and there's Juan on the chat. Hey, Juan. Speaking of, like, we just finished up a project together. Depending on the genre, or depending on, let's take a step back for a second. Let's not talk about genre. Let's talk about, for those of you that are just learning this stuff, just learning about LUFS or have no idea what LUFS is, right? We're just talking about metering. We have to have a way to gauge how loud something is, okay? And when I get a client that says, hey, is this, or they'll even say, like, this isn't as loud as what I'm hearing on Spotify or on Apple Music. If they're playing a file from their phone that I sent them, and then they're comparing that to something on Apple Music, it's already an unfair playing field. It's not a fair comparison is what I'm trying to say. You have to actually play both songs from the same platform, meaning what I sent them and what they're referencing, right? They're playing against, let's say, you know, Juan and I just did a project where you could have compared it to like a Bad Bunny track, or I think it was Bad Bunny and Becky G was the reference. And that you know, if he played that off of Spotify and then played the file off of what I just sent him, he might say, like, hey, it's not as loud as the file on Spotify, or is what I'm hearing on Spotify. And I might respond to him, well, yeah, it is, because I actually downloaded and imported the song that you're referencing in the project that I'm actually mixing and mastering. And I can, even if I didn't hear the two, right, I can put my meter on that reference track, on that file that I downloaded from iTunes, from the store, import it into my DAW, put that metering plugin on, and actually measured that it's at whatever LUFS. And then looking at the meter on my mix and master, I can see that the LUFS value is similar. Okay, that's going to allow me to understand that we are in about the same area of loudness, so that I know what that output volume is going to be. Now I also listen. There's other factors that we're listening for here, like width and punch and low end and brightness and mid range and all that stuff. But the point is, with LUFS, that gives us a way to gauge how loud things are. Now also understand, again, why are we not using, there's other meterings out there. Why aren't we using peak value? There's peak, right? There's a peak meter on all of our DAWs. Well, peak isn't the same because it's instantaneous. We can't measure loudness with instantaneous, signals. What we have to measure to get loudness is over time. It's average. So LUFS gives us that average measurement over time. Now, streaming services, this is sort of like the cherry on the sundae, why we use LUFS. Because LUFS is what the streaming services use. Okay, LUFS is how they are gauging all of this music that's going to their platform. So LUFS is not only just it's a useful tool, but it's also, we're basically seeing what the streaming services are looking at. And there's a whole debate over like, okay, if you're going higher than minus 14 LUFS, which is clearly we're at minus 7 at one point, I think minus 7.5. It's like, well, then why are we going so hot? If they're looking for minus 14 and we send them minus 7, they're just going to turn it down. And this is for like a whole nother, I could make a whole podcast on this debate. Basically, the demand of most clients is to get a louder master, because even though the streaming services are going to adjust the volume, it's still going to sound louder with a minus 8, even minus 9, I would say, is going to sound louder than a minus 14 master. Remember, we're dealing with negative numbers, so minus 14 is quieter than minus 7, okay? You get up to minus 5 or something like that, like a lot of EDM tracks, a lot of pop music, a lot of reggaeton, like a lot of genres are going to hit those higher LUFS values, and that is going to increase the loudness, and it is going to sound different on the platform. I hate to be that guy. There's a lot of purist mastering engineers that are going to kind of thumb their noses at that comment, but the fact of the matter is, like, I've heard quieter masters on streaming platforms, and even though they tell us that they're going to adjust the volume for us, it still sounds louder. So, my advice to you is to understand how to make things louder but still sound good, and I will be there to help you with that as you watch these streams, as we continue these conversations. Now, the question about genres and loudness, to me, no difference. You're going to get, and I actually mentioned Alejandro Sanz as a reference point, as just for a Latin artist. It's funny, you listen to some of his music that sounds more traditional, and that stuff is slamming loud. I mean, you're talking just as loud as like your average reggaeton track. Like, it's loud. So I don't feel like there's a difference in how people are treating genres. I feel like the loudness wars are still alive and well, but still, I urge all of you that are learning how to master to still think about quality. Don't just put that limiter on there and slam it and just try to get things loud, but also work towards quality, because I hope you would all prefer a slightly quieter but better sounding master than something that is just loud for the sake of being loud. So, but again, we're going to have these conversations. We're going to continue to work through stuff. I'm going to show you how we got to where we got, and hopefully that will help you at getting better. I'm just double checking the chat here really quick. Yeah, we're all working on our mastering. But let's so again, we're at about I think I said minus 7 at one of the hot points, maybe minus 7.5. Let's talk about peak level really quick. So that's what we're looking at right here. True peak is as I said, peak is instantaneous. LUFS is average. All right, so we have instantaneous peaks. Why minus 1? What is the reason? The reason is because of streaming. Streaming it's an algorithm. It's like somebody pouring water on something nice that you just made. It's going to affect it. It's not going to be, technically speaking, exact from what you deliver to DistroKid or TuneCore or whatever you're using. There is going to be a slight change, and that slight change can affect something that is mastered at 0. We're talking about peak. You have to make sure that you understand the difference that LUFS is that average reading. Peak is that instantaneous reading, okay? So the instantaneous aspect of it, those peaks, right? That's where we can get into clipping and, redlining and things like that. That is going to actually be affected by the streaming platform. They do things to the audio that if you master something at 0, you could potentially hear some artifacts, things that sound bad happening to that on to what you hear on the streaming service. So we master at -1, or I'll say close to -1, so that way we can avoid what those streaming algorithms are doing. And I know it's a lot of tech talk, but that's part of mastering. We have to understand that in order for you to master well, right? You want to, and for a lot of you that are learning this stuff, you want to continue getting the knowledge of where this music is going. Where is my track going? What I'm working on right now for Barro, is this going to vinyl? Is this going to CD? Is this going to cassette tape, or is it going to Spotify and Tidal, right? Well, more than likely it's going to the latter, right? So I want to make sure that I understand the medium that it's going to, so that it has the best possible experience for the consumer, right? That's what the bottom line is. So yeah, so LUFS, we got integrated, we have short term, and we have -1. True peak is what I am shooting for, okay? And please, any other questions on the metering, let me know. Give me 1 second here. Okay. So let's go ahead and jump to our friends, the limiters. It's like they do the heavy lifting for us. Limiting is essentially where we get our loudness from, okay? Now, limiting is, I'm not going to say, as I said earlier, like slap a limiter on there and just call it quits. No, we have a couple things to keep in mind here. So let's bring these up. Now I have not 1 but 2 limiters, and I do that in an attempt to kind of lighten the load, if you will, of the 1 limiter. So let's go ahead and break this down. Just look at 1 limiter really quick, okay? Yeah, so let's just look at 1 limiter. Let's keep it simple for a minute and talk about what we have going on here. So, 2 of my main controls here are my ceiling, and look at that. That value right there is directly related to this. Okay, so you see the -1 true peak on my limiter, and you can see that 2 very important things we have here. We have true peak turned on. I don't have to get too much into what that actually means. I don't want to right now, but just understand that it is a hard value that's set. So that way, if I set my ceiling at -1, that thing is going to be coming out at -1. You can slam that thing with the limiter, and that value is going to stay around -1, and that's why we use that true peak. So, threshold. Okay, threshold on most limiters are generally an auto makeup gain. So as I bring this value down, we're going to start seeing, and let's check out here what happens at the top of this meter. Watch this.
Yo tengo maestros, no hay de qué escondernos.
So you can see a couple things here indicating what we call gain reduction. So the amount of limiting that's happening, right? We're slicing off all of those transients from the drums and from everything that's. When we heard that difference in the pre-master, right? The pre-master, as I mentioned earlier, sounds potentially a little bit more punchy. We're going to lose some of that when we start applying these things like limiting and compression. And we do it in a way that sounds good. We're not doing it in a way that takes away from the vibe of the drums and the punch of the track. No, we're doing it so that. And this is a good limiter. I highly recommend you all checking out these Isotope Ozone limiters. They're great. I think they're about to come out with Ozone 10, but this is Ozone 9. But basically, as we bring this threshold down, we're going to hear the volume go up, okay? And that is going to be done with gain reduction. So the more we do this, okay, we're slicing off all that stuff that's happening, and we can visually see what those transients look like. If we look at our file, right, we can see those little peaks right there, like all that stuff, these are our transients. And the more that we slice these off, the louder we can get the audio. Does it sound good? Well, that's the question. That's the question that we always ask ourselves. Like, does this sound better? Is the loudness worth what we're cutting off from the track? So we have a question here. Is a limiter in Ozone 9 Elements particularly different? I don't think so. It's a good question. So is the limiter different in Ozone 9 Elements than it is in Ozone 9 Advanced? I would say no. I don't see why. I think what they do with Elements is they only have a certain amount of processors that you can use. You might also want to look at this section here. They may have taken away some of these other algorithms. So this stuff here, again, it's like we could talk about some of this stuff for hours, but I want to keep it simple for y'all. But if you look at this section here, these are actually different algorithms or different flavors, if you will. Because when you're making stuff, when you're limiting, right, think of it as using any compressor, right? There's different compressors that we like to use for different colors, different textures, sometimes for different genres or different instruments. And in this case, we have different algorithms that we can try that will sound different depending on the material that's going through it, whether it's something that's more aggressive, whether it's something that's smoother. If I'm mastering a classical piece versus a reggaeton track, that could potentially benefit from one of these different algorithms. So look at that on the Ozone 9 Essentials. That may be the difference there. So I'm using the this IRC4 and particularly the modern algorithm. There's even different variations there depending on what I'm working on. So great question. So bringing the threshold down is going to start slicing off those transients, and then the volume is going to go up as a result. And it's going to hit our ceiling, which is at -1 true peak, and it's not going to allow it to go past that. So as I continue to bring the threshold down, things might start sounding kind of nasty. So the idea here is that I'm using 2 limiters so that I can hopefully do a little bit less processing on this one and do some of that processing on here. It's like one person lifting up something heavy versus 2 people lifting up something heavy. So hopefully that benefits my my process. So that's kind of what's going on there. So we have, you can notice here that I don't have anything happening with my ceiling or my true peak. All that stuff is off because all this is doing is just slicing off those transients, turning up the volume, and then it's immediately going into this limiter, which is then doing the rest of the heavy lifting. There are other things on here that we can adjust, like transient emphasis, which gives us more punch, which as always gives us some type of, it could be, we might get some distortion, or it might sound amazing, but we just have to try it out. So, there's not a whole lot of, it is creative in the sense that compression could be considered creative, but, I don't want to say there's one thing to do that always works with this stuff. You have to listen. You have to fine tune. And many times, like when I'm at the end of the mastering process, like everything sounds great, but I'm just trying to get it perfect. Like these things can change so slightly. Like this release time here, that's what this actually is. It says character, but it's release time. This may have been as fast as possible. It may have looked like this. But as I was getting to that end point of the process, I might have inched it back to where it is now. And that slightly slower, just ever so slightly slower release time gave me what I wanted. So fine-tuning things is the name of the game with a lot of this. But that is what's happening here with these limiters. And we can go deeper if there's questions, or if we find ourselves going deeper with that. That would be awesome. And you know what? I can probably do some A/B comparisons with this stuff for you, so that way we can kind of get a better feel for what they're doing. I see another question here. So, what's the purpose of the stereo independence? That's a really good question. So imagine, your left and right signal for a stereo master is different. There's different things happening, right? Your drums are generally down the center, your kicks, your snares, even your lead vocal, your bass. But there's so much happening out here in the stereo kind of information left and right is different. If you look at your meters, right? If we look at our meters, we can see that they're. Let's look at our nice expensive meter here. You'll notice that these two left and right meters are doing different things. Right there, they're slightly different. You're not seeing, I mean, they're moving pretty fast, but there's a difference between the two. And the limiter is going to respond either to the loudest thing and then basically limiting equally to both sides, or if we adjust the stereo independence, we can actually tell it to look at both sides and actually process each side independently so that it's not just doing the same thing to both sides based on the loudest signal. So that's and does it change the sound? Absolutely. You might find that by doing that just on the transient, right, listening to the kicks and the snares and the punchy stuff, that by changing, when it's not independent, it's what we call linked, right? So the loudest sound comes in, the limiter sees it, and it does the same thing to both sides. That's linked. So as we alter how linked those two sides are, the sound could change. It could get wider. We might find that it gets louder better, but those are things. And then we have sustain, which is everything but transient information. Like, your sustained portions, your sustained sounds can benefit from unlinking to a certain extent. Those the sustained information. So yeah, it's a little. Yeah, no worries. It is a lot. It's a lot. And look, folks, I don't touch half this stuff if I don't have to. I mean, if I'm sitting here and I'm going like, oh man, this thing is so close. There's just like this one thing that I can't get right. I may dive into this stuff. I may unlink and then just start adjusting this and seeing like, all right, does that help? Does it sound worse? And I do have to dive into some of this stuff. Is the release time? Those are things that I do end up having to adjust when needed. But a lot of the times it's just like, I need to get my loudness. I need to make sure that my peak level is going to be good. Let's move on unless I have to dive in. So, and eventually what you're going to get better at as you work more towards this mastering stuff is you're eventually going to realize what each thing does. You're going to be like, oh, when I adjust the release time, things get louder, or things get quieter, or things get less distorted, or they get more distorted, or they get punchier, or they get smoother. Those are the kinds of things that you are going to find as you go down this journey with your mastering. So let's jump into the Shadow Hills. This is a beautiful, and fortunately for me at the time, it was free. You can all check out Plugin Alliance and look on their site and see they had a deal where there were three plugin companies that were merging. It was Native Instruments, Plugin Alliance, and there was one other one. So go on Plugin Alliance and see if they're still running that deal, because basically if you just give them your email, you get like all these free plugins, and this was one of them. This is the Shadow Hills mastering compressor, which is an actual hardware box. It's like a $3,000 box, like an actual analog, voltage and heat and electricity, like all that stuff. And this thing is just notorious for being on a lot of big projects. It's beautiful looking. But what does it do? Okay. So, as I mentioned, there's probably a lot we could go into. There's a big rabbit hole that we can go down when talking about this particular plugin. But what I will say, if I want to keep it simple for now, we have two different circuits. You know how I had two limiters? Imagine two of these, right? One of them is what we call an optical compressor, which is another flavor of compression. And then we have this one here, which is a discrete compressor. So two different kinds of compressors mashed into one. Okay, we got one that's happening first and one that's happening second. And I can choose to either use the first one or the second one or both. Okay? Now, when I use this compressor, and like many things, you can just start by putting it on and just, abusing it. Let me give you an example here. So I'm going to duplicate this really quick. Let's go ahead and I'm going to turn this off for a second. Let's pretend for a minute that I actually got to the point of mastering where I'm ready to use this. So let's see. Here's my Shadow Hills. I'm going to bring it up here. I'm going to save my other one so I don't lose my settings. And yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring down my threshold. Okay, so the threshold's sitting up here, nothing's happening. I'm going to bring it down until we start hearing or seeing and hearing some type of change. So listen. And I will say, keep your eye on this meter right here. Okay. Okay, you see it starting to work. So I'll let you know right now, the obvious change, which I'm sure a lot of you heard, is the volume. Folks, that is all a compressor does. It makes things quieter. That's it. It is an amplifier that reduces its output. That's it. Okay? Now, how it does that is the looming question of what compressor do I use, what settings do I use, but it's all focused on the same basic concept, is that we're making things quieter. And if that's oversimplification, just keep that in the back of your head, because that is what we are dealing with when we're dealing with compression. Now, it got quieter. We saw this needle move more, which means we're getting more, there's that word again, gain reduction, just like the limiter. Okay, so we're seeing this thing act. What does it do? How does it sound? Okay, that's where we start getting into the creative aspect of it. Now, when I started doing this, I started hearing a change in the sound. Listen. There's a couple things that you can pick out from there. It's punchier and it has attitude. It's got like a different vibe to it. It's almost more aggressive. Okay? So that's an artifact, or a characteristic, I should say, that we may get with this optical compressor right here. You may be wondering why I'm not using both left and right sides. They are, I like how this term is sort of coming back, linked. So as I'm doing something to the left side, it is affecting both at the same time, okay? That's where that linked function comes into play, just like we talked about with the limiter. So that's what I'm hearing right now. Do I like it? And that's where we get into now this creative use in the mastering process. What am I trying to achieve? Do I just do this because someone told me to do it? No. You have to have, well, a couple things to keep in mind here. One, it is nice to have some kind of goal, right? Like maybe you're hearing this song, you're like, oh, this is great, but I just really want it to vibe a little bit more. I want it to punch a little bit more. This may be the thing that does it for you. Maybe you needed that aggression, that punch. Cool. But then there's another level to it. There is experimentation, right? So this is one sound. Okay, well, let's go ahead and put that on the back burner. I'm going to turn this back up so we don't hear any of the compression. And now I'm going to use this one, this discrete threshold, and let's hear what this does. I got real quiet. It's even punchier. It's punchier, and it definitely has more aggression to it versus this one. It's just different, right? It's doing the same thing but differently. Now, this one has a lot more control to it. I can adjust attack time, which will change the punch. I can adjust the release time, which will change that sense of aggression. But that's basically what I did when I brought this up. I was like, all right, what is this doing? Okay, now let me back it off a little bit so I just get a little bit of that as opposed to 100% of that. Okay, so that was the first thing I did. And then the next thing was I adjusted this, or I may have done one or the other. It might have been like, okay, let me do this. Okay, now again, the volume drops, right? So to make up for that volume drop, I have this output. I can turn it up. So when I bypass it, the volume should be about the same. So it's got that a little bit more aggression with it turned on, right? But the volume doesn't change because, again, turning up the output gain. Now, as I recall, what happened here was I adjusted this. It sounded great. And probably towards further into the mastering process, closer to the end, I think, I went ahead and started adjusting this. Okay? Because remember, this is happening, the optical, this, is happening before this. So everything is set up. I got my EQs going, my limiting. I got, one part of this compressor going. And then I'm just like, let me see what happens if I just add a little bit of this. And I just start adjusting it, and it just feels right. That's it. Simply put, it just felt right. I'm not looking at numbers. I'm not looking at meters. It just felt right. Now, something that I love about this compressor, if you ever do decide to use it, once you set everything you like, you have a mix wet dry. So I could put this thing at 0%, not hear it at all, or I can just bring in 10% or even 50% or 75% and just have a blend. So maybe I like it, but I just don't want as much. I can pull it back to 50% and blend it in there. So that's the Shadow Hills. This is just a beautiful thing to add some texture, some punch, and to kind of glue things together in a way that I think expect mastering to kind of do its thing. So here, let me get rid of this one and let's look at what I have happening on this one. So this is the actual compressor that we used. Yeah, so we can see that we have things happening in both the optical compressor and the discrete. So they're both sides are being used, and we can see that the mix wet dry is at 30%. I'm only using 30%. So if I turn this off, so that's off, on. So yeah, so there is like a difference in the vibe when you turn it on. Yeah, the volume does jump up slightly, but that's okay. There's no one there sitting behind me going like, oh, the gain has to be the same when you turn it on. Like, that's just a way for us, and for those of you that are still learning this stuff, you will absolutely learn better. Not just from a learning perspective, but from just applying this stuff in your mixes and your masters. You need to gain match your plugins, specifically your compressors. Don't just, I'm not going to call Slate out, but I'm going to call Slate out. The Slate distressor absolutely makes things louder when you put it on. And they do that on purpose because they want you to think that the compressor is doing something better. So when you're applying that compression, adjust that output gain, match that loudness, bypass it, listen, turn it back on, listen. Make sure you're getting what you want from it, and then adjust to taste. Adjust the wet dry, adjust the output level, whatever you got to do. That's just my 2 cents on that matter. So yeah, so we have our limiting, we have our compression. That's a huge part of the loudness and the sound of what we're doing. But now let's dive into, we got a couple things here that are normally part of my mastering chain, but I didn't need to use it, so didn't need to make things wider. That's what these both are. So I was going to delete them, but you know what? Let's just go into the next processor. So we got, here's our first EQ that we're looking at. Now, I love adding low end to mastering. I'm not just going to do it just to do it, but I might experiment with it and see what it does. Remember, when you're mastering, when you're dealing, in this case at least, when we're dealing with a stereo file, when you turn up something like an EQ, let's say we're adding this low end, you're turning up everything in that low frequency, right? So let's see what happens when I turn off this. Sorry. Let's see what happens when I turn off this low frequency band really quick. That's off. Here's on. Off. On. Off. On. So if you're listening in like headphones or you're on speakers that have a lot of bass, you can hear that the low end is definitely popping out more, but in a tasteful way, right? We're not, if I turn this up a lot, we're going to hear. So what you're hearing when I do that, it's driving all that other stuff, that Shadow Hills compressor, those limiters, harder with that low information. So we want to do something that sounds like it's benefiting the master, enhancing the master, but we also have to keep in mind it's going to affect everything else downstream. And that's why when we talk about signal flow and those types of things, it's good to keep in the back of your mind what's happening. That's why I like, Ableton with this setup, because you can see the signal flow kind of right in front of you, which most DAWs you can, right? Top to bottom, left to right. But it's important to understand how when I turn something up, it will affect everything downstream. Now, understand that the information in that low frequency, that low band, right? We had the lows of the toms, we had the kick, we had the bass. So if I start turning that up and then the bass is louder in the mix, well, Jose might come back and say, you know what, everything's great, but can you, and he said this to me in the past about other things, like, can you keep the same low end that I had in the mix? So, to me, I might think I'm enhancing something, but I might actually be hindering. So in this case, he was happy with what I did, but that's what's going on there, right? On the technical side, we're adding energy that could overdrive things, potentially in a bad way, but hopefully in a good way. And then we're also bringing out like nice stuff in the mix that it needs. All right, we have a question here. Yeah, so let's see here. Yes, let me just take a look. Give me 1 second. Well, so let me answer the question first about the compressor. So yeah, it's so the question here is like, okay, is the goal for the compressor to do its job while maintaining the same perceived loudness? So understand that the reason why I was talking about gain matching is just to be able to eliminate that loudness difference between the compressed and the uncompressed. Because the moment you turn that compressor on, and if it sounds louder for whatever reason, that's just what the manufacturer did, or you had the volume up or whatever, maybe there's an auto makeup gain on there, which happens with a lot of compressors, you are immediately eliminating the comparison. Your ears are going to tell you that the louder sound is better. And the problem is that sometimes the compression might make things have less low end, or they might sound less punchy, or they might change the vibe of the sound for the worst. And you won't understand that unless you gain match, right? The same loudness that you're hearing. And I think that's why you said perceived loudness. So that's fine. I understand what you're saying there. So yeah, just that gain matching is going to allow you to make better decisions, hands down. And then once you know that you got what you liked, right? Oh, it makes it punchier. I like that. Or, oh, it's actually killing the sound a little bit. Let me go with another setting or another compressor, or no compressor at all. It'll help you make those decisions better. So yeah, good question. And then just a comment here about the low end's nice. Yeah, exactly. So it's discreet, it's tasteful, right? It adds to the track. It doesn't do something weird. It doesn't take away from it. So yeah, that's the point. So let's look at more stuff here. We have this sort of high mid. Oh, and actually, I do want to point out that this is the default frequency on this Slate EQ. So this is from the Slate Everything bundle. This is the Neve model that they have, the FGN, which is Neve basically. But this frequency, it's just the default. So I just kind of like turned it up and I was like, oh, it sounds really nice. And that's it. And I moved on. You can adjust this a little bit. Like if I turn this up more, right? If I go more for the low mids, right up here in the 100 hertz, 200 hertz, hell, let's hear what happens. I'm going to try it. So I don't know if you could hear it. Listen to the backgrounds. Listen to the ooh. Listen to that. Listen to what happens just by default with what I have. And then I'm going to do it and turn the frequency up. And I want you to hear how those change. So listen. Okay, now listen. I'm going to turn this all the way up to 2, whatever that is, 220. They're louder and they're muddier. There's more, the low frequencies from those background vocals are now coming out which is changing the mix. Not only is it changing the mix, but it's changing just the overall clarity of that. So as I'm turning, these frequencies up and down, I'm listening. How is this changing? Does this feel right? And the only thing that's ever going to answer that question for you is just by, maybe listening to the pre-master to make sure you're not getting too far left from the vibe that they want. But maybe it's also listening to a reference, like some track out there that's already been released, it's been professionally mixed and mastered, that you can sort of use as a template. So these are all things that I'm thinking about. Okay, so now let's talk about this high mid band here. We have about it looks like 3.4, we'll say 3.5K, sure, why not? That is a harsher band of frequencies, right? Let's hear what that sounds like as I increase. So we have 2 decibels taken out. Okay, for mastering, that's pretty substantial. Because remember, as you're reducing that or gaining or adding, I should say, we're basically doing that across the whole mix spectrum. So we're doing that to every instrument in the mix. So let me increase it and decrease it so you can hear how it changes the sound.
Listo. Bailando boca a boca, bailando boca a boca, ella me lo da, el beso me lo da, siempre me provoca, beso en su boca, pero ya no está, ella ya no está.
Okay, so that was increasing and decreasing that range. As I increased it, we heard more aggression. As we decreased it, we heard a lot of the presence of the mix go away. It almost sounded like it was getting filtered out. So that's an important range, okay? And again, this being a good mix, we didn't need to do a lot to it, but as we limit, as we compress, those things tend to come to the surface, okay? Limiting and compression sometimes can be looked at as a microscope on your mix. Okay, things that were just kind of down there, kind of quiet, are now going to come. They're going to bubble to the surface, and we're going to see it more for what it is. Like, okay, there was a little bit of harshness, but now there's a lot of harshness because of the limiting and compression. So many times that will be just something that needs to happen because of the loudness factor. So that's that high mid range, and that could be anywhere from 1K all the way up to like 5K, 6K potentially, but you just have to experiment. So yeah, 2 dB is pretty substantial, but hey, I've had to do more, I've had to do less, just depends. So up here we have a high shelf, and I don't even know what the frequency is, honestly, that this thing's boosting. There's nothing here that tells me. I can't adjust it, but I'm adding a little bit, and this is why. Okay, this is a little trick that someone taught me once about mastering. So if you have to do this, if you have to take something away, you normally want to add a little bit back somewhere else. So, and actually, let me see if I can display this better. Can I duplicate this easier? Hey, go Ableton. Yes, I can. So I'm actually going to, let me just use the power of Ableton here. Ableton lets you set up these macros, which are like super awesome. So basically, I'm going to create a version of this plugin where we just have the low end boost, okay? And then we have the version of what the master actually was with this high mid dip and this boost in the high end. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to macros it so that way when I hit a button, it is going to alter both of these. It's going to flip one on and one off. So here you go. There's another point for Ableton. Ding. That's going to be for future streams. So if I hit M, check this out. See? It turns that one on and turns that off. Super awesome. All right. So we're going to hear the difference now. We're going to flip it, and we're going to hear what the mastered version sounds like, and then we're going to hear it without the high mids and the highs. Okay, here we go. So here's the original. And here's before the EQ. Here's on, smoother. Okay, here's off. So if you're listening, especially if you're listening through earbuds or something, less than desirable listening systems, you'd hear this. This is the range of frequencies that is present in every playback system, these high mids. So basically this little dip right here is controlling some of that harshness, but then adding this up top is giving a little bit of that energy back. So we're taking a little away, we're adding a little back, but we're adding it in a smoother, nicer sounding part of the spectrum, at least for this mix. Every song is different, right? That nice part of the spectrum might be lower or it could be higher, but all we can do is experiment. So, yeah, I love the macros in live. So yeah, so when I went to the sort of the pre-EQ version, we heard more of that harshness coming back, and that's a lot of what we have to control sometimes in the mastering. Great questions, by the way. Thank you so much for jumping in with those. So let's go ahead and so that's the EQ. We talked about EQ. We talked about compression. We have another EQ here, and one of my favorite ways of EQing is mid-side EQ. And if you've seen some of my other streams, you've probably heard me talk a lot about mid-side EQ and mid-side processing in general. So imagine for a minute that your stereo field has been broken up, not left and right. Okay, if you think about most EQ, like what we were just looking at, most EQ, most compression, we're dealing in stereo. So I am just EQing the whole stereo spectrum, everything from left to right that you're hearing, right? Or if I'm compressing, like with the Shadow Hills, we're compressing everything that we hear. Now imagine that we break up the stereo image to middle, so what's right in front of you in the middle, and then everything that's out here, or what we call the sides. So where my microphone is, that's your mid. Everything outside to the furthest left and right that you can get is this, what we call the sides. So what does that help us with in audio? Well, think of everything that's in that middle. A majority of your kick information, a majority of your bass information, a majority of your vocal, your snare. So much is in the middle. Whereas on the sides, we have everything else that is wide. Okay? Reverbs, background vocals, synths, pianos. If your 808 is wide, you have 808 information in both the middle and the side. So it really just varies from arrangement to arrangement. But what this allows us to do is it allows us to EQ and process things independently from the middle to the sides. It's a beautiful thing. So what this does for me is it gives me this, I have this variation here. What does this do for us? It adds depth. It actually adds something nice to the music. When you listen to your favorite artist and you listen, maybe you're at the point where you're just like, I can get things to sound pretty good, but there's this difference. There's this thing. What is that thing that sounds different between my mixes, my masters, meaning you, and your professional references? Okay? What is the difference? And sometimes, I'm going to even go out on a limb and say many times, it could be depth. Okay, depth may be something that you can hear. Maybe it's something that you're just starting to hear. But it's that Z-axis. It's that feeling of something that's not just left and right. It's not just two-dimensional. It feels three-dimensional. Mid-side processing helps us with that. Okay, specifically mid-side EQs. Now, when we look at this, okay, let's pretend that we're not even dealing with mid-side for a minute. Let's just talk about the EQ in general. Okay, we have a band here that I'm adjusting, which is about, let's go up here, about 450. I was about to say 4,500. Don't even ask. And then we have down here, we have a band of about, let's say 80 hertz for the sake of example. And this guy right here is just kind of redundant. Like I didn't really need to do that, but in the moment, I do weird things. So let's just pretend that we're dealing with 80 hertz, and then we got 450. So what do those sound like? What does 450 and 800, or excuse me, 450 and 80 sound like? Okay. Well, let's see. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave these alone because Ableton does not like undoing things on this EQ. It's just not nice like that. But I'm going to turn these off for a second. So while I'm playing it, I'm going to turn this off, and let's hear what happens if we add this 80 hertz back into the mastering.
Listo. Bailando boca a
And it's
boca,
off.
bailando boca a boca. Ella me lo da, el beso me lo da.
So you may have heard that the bass and the kick actually got louder when I added those back in. Let's boost it and kind of put like an obnoxious amount of it in. Let's hear what this does.
Listo. Bailando boca a boca, bailando boca a boca. Ella me lo da, el beso me lo da. Ella siempre me
Right, so it's like it's the kick, it's the bass, it's the low end of the toms. Like it's a lot of that stuff. It's a lot of that stuff that we heard on this EQ, right? It's very similar. I mean, look at what I'm boosting here. I'm boosting 83 hertz, right? So why am I boosting on one EQ and taking away on another? Let's think about that for a second. Did I have no idea what was going on? Sometimes, but but actually what's happening here is we have an EQ here that's more specific, more precise, more surgical, okay, which is the reason why I like using, for those of you that are just learning about EQ, we have a more narrow bandwidth, that's this factor, on top of the mid-side aspect. So we actually have a little bit more happening here than out here, so we're creating that depth. Think about it like this, right? Imagine you're looking at like a big rock wall, right? One of those rock walls that people climb. One of the ways I like to visually kind of imagine what mid-side is, right? Imagine just taking a little bit out of the rock wall just here and leaving everything intact here. Versus with a stereo EQ, we'd be carving a hole out of the whole wall from left to right. Okay, so that's a different kind of depth. But with mid-side EQ, we're just taking like one boulder out here and we're leaving the rest here. So think about how the whole is different, right? How the depth looks different doing it out of a section versus out of the whole wall from left to right. That's how I think of stereo EQ versus mid-side EQ. So we're doing mid-side EQ in this section here. And then on this EQ, we're boosting everything using what's called a shelving curve. So it's everything happening. I'm actually going to bring up on this EQ. You see how this little symbol changed? See that? That's a shelving curve. That's what that looks like. Okay, and you can see what this looks like here, this bell curve. It's a different curve, right? So imagine that I'm just kind of shaping the sound here. Okay, I'm shaping the specifics of the mix. And then I'm taking all the good stuff, that new version, if you will, and I'm boosting all of that up just a little bit. So I've rebalanced the kick and the bass within the context of the track. And now I'm bringing all of that nice stuff up just a little bit, just to give the whole master a little bit more of that energy on the bottom end. Okay, so yeah, so we're reshaping, and then we're sort of like pushing forward all the nice stuff that we just did to help with the overall sound. I hope that makes sense. Now, this 400 range that we're dealing with, 450, let's hear what happens when I boost that up.
Bailando boca a boca, bailando boca a boca. Ella me lo da, el beso me lo da. Ella siempre me provoca, un beso en su boca, pero ya no está. Ella ya.
So that's a lot of, and that starts getting into what we call like the boxy range of frequencies. You might hear that in a mix or a master where it's like, it sounds kind of narrow. It sounds a little small, and sometimes that's because we get a buildup of those frequencies in what we call the boxy range. And this can range anywhere from you can start hearing it as low as 250 all the way up to like 1.5 kilohertz. But yeah, so bringing that down a little bit is just clearing up some of that, what may be considered sort of a boxier range. But you can hear that it's like the tone of the guitars, the vocal. So we don't want to take too much of it out, because then all of a sudden we get this. That's what happens if we take too much out. Sounded weird, right? That's what happens. It sounds like we're in an airplane and the pressure's changing. We're taking out too much of that good stuff. So that tone is needed for the realism of the sounds. We don't want to take too much of that out. Let's see. We got a question here in the chat. So basically, whatever you're taking down, you're bringing back now that it's cleaner. Yeah, you could look at it that way. When I do a lot of mixing, I use this term balance of frequencies. And in mastering, I've come to realize that we do a lot of that with these stereo EQs or mid-side EQs or whatever kind of EQ you're using. You might say to yourself, you know what, like I can hear something popping out in the voice that's a little harsh, right? So you pull a bit of that down, everything feels better. But then it's like, okay, well, the overall mix can use a little bit more high end. So then you start adding that back in on another EQ, or maybe, just like on another EQ, maybe that just sounds nice. It's a colorful EQ. Maybe it's an analog modeling EQ or whatever. And that's going to help kind of bring that new balanced version of that high end back in a nicer way. So yeah, you can look at it that way if you want. And that's across the whole spectrum. It could be in the mids, could be in the low mids, it could be you clear up some muddiness with the low mids, and then you kind of bring up all the lows together because it feels better now. That's all. So great question. And yes, you are correct. Let's move on to the next thing. So I actually have this compressor on the front end. So we talked about the Shadow Hills on kind of the back end near the limiters. I'm actually using this compressor here because it just has a different sound. This is Native Instruments Supercharger GT. It's not a free plugin. If you have Native Instruments, I think by default you get the regular Supercharger. This is like the high-end version. When you buy like the Ultimate, you upgrade to Ultimate, Complete Ultimate, you get this. So yeah, it's a pretty simple compressor to use. I don't know if I'm even doing any compression. This is our gain reduction. Let's see what's happening here. And it's barely moving. That needle is barely moving. I can almost guarantee you I'm using it just for this here. And this is our saturation knob. Okay, so what is saturation doing? It's distortion, simply put. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this up. And let's take a listen to what happens when I oversaturate this. So you hear like when I crank up the saturation, we really get like an aggressiveness, almost like a distortion, right? That's basically what it's doing. Now, I'm using a little bit of saturation. So let's turn this off and hear what happens when I turn this off. So here's before. And here's after. So it's just a little bit of a lift in like the energy. I mean, there's different settings here. I could do moderate saturation, heavy saturation, but just this mild setting, just turning it up a little bit. And as I said in the, I think when we were going over the Shadow Hills. Actually, it was everything. With the limiter, with the Shadow Hills compressor. There's this point when you're doing the mastering, and I urge you all to check out one of the live masterings that I do, or if I'm doing mixing and mastering. There's a point where we are just fine-tuning everything. And it could have been to the point where I was saying to myself, you know what, this is great, but let me just see what happens. And I turn up the saturation a little bit, and I'm like, I like that. And maybe it's because I need a little bit more loudness. Maybe it's just because. There's a lot of opportunity, especially with like some of these, if you're using the Slate stuff and you bring up, for example, the, their console emulation. It's like, let me just try turning on a console emulation. Let me see what happens if I add the sound of this console or this console and just hear what each texture does. And then let me increase the drive, which is saturation. And let me just see what happens. And that's okay. Let me just see what happens when I turn up. Oh, I realized that I also added a little of this frequency here. No one called me out on that, but that's okay. It was 0.8 dB, but it has a purpose. Let me just try turning up this band. Let me just hear what happens, right? But you have to make sure that you reel it back. You have to make sure that you're bypassing stuff and just listening for, okay, is this doing something good, or is this doing something bad? Okay. And again, that all could be dependent on listening to a reference, or listening to the pre-master, or just your experience. And all of these things are going to factor into to whether or not you're making the right decision. So let's touch on one more thing before we wrap things up. As always, just kind of, I really appreciate everybody hanging out, number one. But yeah, if there's any questions about what I'm talking about, just throw them in the chat. Happy to address those. Now, I'm going to show you some of the secret sauce for those of you that hung around to the end. There is something that I have been doing on mixing and mastering lately that, in my opinion, I've been actually told by some really high-level professionals that we are walking in an area of an uncharted territory. Okay, this is something that not a lot of people are doing, but I am doing it because I'm trying to, and I urge all of you to try this stuff, right? Pushing boundaries. Try doing different things. There's no reason why you can't use, let's say a compressor just has like an EQ on it that, like, for example, the supercharger has EQ on it. Maybe I just want to use this compressor for the EQ. Maybe I just want to use it for the saturation. Maybe I want to see what, I'm just trying to think of something off the top of my head. Maybe there's like a distortion plugin that you like that you would normally not use for mastering, but you do. Just try misusing stuff is what I'm trying to say. You never know what can happen, but I am using a plugin, and I'll go ahead and just kind of promote this for a second because we are working with the developer of this plugin. This is called the RL360 plugin. This is the company right here, Artisans, so artisans.com. Check them out. I actually have a coupon code if you choose to use this. And if you check out any of my mixing streams, you'll see me using this in the mix, and it's pretty cool. Basically, what we're dealing with here is binaural panning. So binaural, if you listen to any of Apple's spatial audio, you are hearing a binaural effect happening in your ears. And what that is basically the model of your head. How do we hear things in reality? Like when I walk down the street, I hear a car whizzing past me. I hear a bird over here. Someone's talking to you. They move around you. Like how are you perceiving that sound going around your head? And the way that we emulate that in stereo is by using what we call binaural. Okay, so that is taking into account the shape of the human head and allowing us to simulate the way the sound moves around, and in this case with this plugin, even above and below your head. So in stereo, we just have left and right. There's really no depth. We create the illusion of depth by using things like EQ, mid-side EQ, reverbs, differences in volume, differences in EQ, all of those things. I already said EQ, but you know what I mean. We use all of these things to create this illusion of depth, but when the creator of this plugin told me about it, and I was like, let me just try experimenting with this thing, I started misusing it in a way that I felt would maybe stumble upon something interesting. And there's actually a song that's about to be released, I think in like a day or two, by Lamantro. If you do check them out, here I'm going to go ahead and plug Lamantro real quick. I've done a lot of work with them. But there is a song about to come out. If you check it out on the 31st, I want to see if they have it listed on here. Normally it says like new release or something coming out. Yeah, it's not out yet, but it's supposed to come out on the 31st. But when you hear that song, that was one of the first songs that I started experimenting with the binaural panning on. So you're gonna hear things that feel like they're slightly behind you, like. It's really cool. So I urge you to check that out. I'll plug it again on the next stream. But yeah, check out that song. It's really cool stuff. So what I'm doing in the mastering is I'm using not one but two of the binaural plugins to try to create a sense of spaciousness that I may not be able to achieve with normal stereo processing. So let's take a look at this. Now, if I had my little counter for Ableton points, I'd probably put number 3. I think we're probably at number 4 at this point up here, because this is what you're seeing here is one of the benefits of working in Ableton Live. We have 2 channels, 2 copies of our sound going on the same audio channel. So I don't need two separate channels. I don't need to use an aux send or a bus send in order to create this effect. I can do it on this channel, and that's just done by grouping two plugins or grouping a series of plugins, and then I can just boom, I could put another instance of it below, and then I immediately have what's essentially two parallel chains going side by side. So that's what's happening here. I have my dry, completely unaffected version of the signal, and then I have the wet, which is the processing. Okay, so that's what we're looking at here in Ableton Live. Now, what is happening on the wet channel? What is this binaural crazy stuff? Well, let me just make it clear here. Okay, I'm not trying to do what Apple's doing with spatial audio. Right? They're trying to make you go, whoa, this is new, this is different, this is weird, I like it, I don't know why. You turn your head, the music goes this way. Like there's that aspect to this technology. What I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to enhance. I don't want my client saying like, dude, this is weird. I don't want my client saying that. I want my client saying like, this sounds amazing, and I don't know why. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to do with this particular plugin. So I'm going to bypass this, and I want you to hear what it's taking away. And it may be subtle enough, it may be a detail that you pick up on, or maybe you don't. Okay, but let's hear what happens when I bypass this spatial audio plugin. Okay, so this is with it on. Here's off. Here's on. Here's off. Here's on. So to me, whether you're picking up on this or not, it's okay. Sometimes when you're still learning these details, you're still ear training, you may not pick up on these things. But there is a sense of depth. There's a sort of a glue that I get, if that makes sense, to the track. And it's something that I would probably have a hard time achieving with other means. So what's going on here? All right, well, we have a left and a right version of this crazy binaural plugin. This is what it looks like. So basically, I'm taking the left side of my mix, and look, like if you're just talking about conventional mastering, you can just stop right now because now we're talking about some weird shit. I mean, this is like, we're doing different things now to try to give people an experience, to try to make people, experience the music in a different way. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel here, but I am trying to add something special that maybe someone hasn't done before. So yeah, we have. So on to the weird part of the stream. So we have two instances of this RL360 plugin. They're basically, I have the left side of my stereo mix being processed, the left side of my mix being processed, and the right side of my mix being processed. One by the left side of this and by the right side. Okay. There's a routing in Ableton I'm doing. We can have another conversation about that, but let's just kind of like make it as simple as we can. So I'm putting the left side of the master behind and to the left of you, and I'm putting the right side of the master behind and to the right of you. So let me just solo the spatial audio part of this so you can hear exactly what's being blended. So here it is. Here, I'll turn it up. Sounds kind of weird, right? It's like the voice is very present, but everything else is kind of like behind you. It's not meant to be 100% like that, right? We're just adding in that nuance, hence the parallel processing. If I just bypassed this whole deal right here and sent it off to Jose, he'd be like, this is cool. Done. But this is one of those things that I feel like people will appreciate in headphones, because binaural is mainly perceived in headphones. You're not going to get this wow factor in speakers as much as you would in headphones. But again, it's a detail. I'm not going for wow factor, but I am going for nuance. And I hope one thing that maybe you take away from all this today is that detail, and I've said this in previous streams, the detail is what makes the big difference. We have a lot of details happening here, right? We have, subtle saturation with this compressor. We have subtle EQ. I just realized I did jump over this compressor right here. We have subtle saturation, subtle EQ going on here. We have fairly subtle EQ happening here. Yeah, this is pretty subtle. This is a little bit extreme, but that happens. Okay, but a majority of things have been pretty subtle up to this point. We have compression happening here, but only 30%, right? We don't have 100% of all that compression. We only have 30% of that. So details. It's all about the details, and they add up. So when you're mastering, you don't have to go for this crazy change with one sound. Try different processors a little bit to try to achieve what you're going for. I do, yeah. If you are interested in it, you can, when you check out on his website, you can use the coupon code MBM for Mark Barrie Music 10. So MBM 10, and I believe Corey has a coupon code as well for the 10% off. I think it's Colormine 10 or Colormine Music, but you can use them both for the same thing. Yeah, it's just MBM 10. Just use that in the checkout, and that'll give you 10% off. He's already running it for 60. So you can get another 10% off of that. I think it's well worth it. I spend my money on plugins that are unique, that I don't have a ton of already. And if you're looking for something to, I'll make sure Corey checks out. Make sure you check out on that spreadsheet if that's the right one. But either way, they're both going to work. If one doesn't work, you could use the other one. But yeah, I appreciate you checking that out. Okay, cool. So that's just a little bit about. Oh, and sorry, I got sidetracked there with the coupon code. So yeah, details. It's all about the details, subtlety. Let all those little things add up, and then fine tune things as you go through. Do you ever use this while mixing? Yes, and I mentioned that a little bit earlier. That in a lot of the song that's coming out by Lamantro, today's the 29th. It's actually in 2 days, on the 31st. When that song comes out, when you listen to it, you're going to hear a couple. I mean, there's some guitar parts. There's things in there that I use the binaural processing on. We actually have. There we go. We have a breakdown on the Colormine YouTube channel. If you go to Colormine Music on YouTube, there's a breakdown of, and he's going to have to tell me or maybe he'll put that link in the chat for that. For that song, and you'll see me using it. And there's another one I did a mix from I'm Really a T-Rex. What song was that? I want to say it was Let Go. Yeah, it was Let Go. What was the other one? You're All Right. I think we did that mix as well. Maybe not, but either way, Let Go, and then the song by Lamantro. Both of those feature the binaural panning within the mix. So super cool stuff. Check that out. And so the last compressor, I actually kind of overshot this one. Sorry about that, or overlooked it. Let's see what's going on here. Okay. So this is actually an example of mid-side compression. And when we talk about EQing the middle versus the sides independently, I was talking about that depth, right? But if we compress the middle separate from the sides, what happens is we bring that middle down and we get a perception of width. So because we're using compression, right, we're actually working to control something. It's not just volume, but I'm actually bringing the vocal and the snare down differently, or I should say, in relation to other things that are in that middle section. So compression is going to, we're going to control the dynamic range of the kick and the snare and the vocal and all those things that are in the middle. So the compression by nature is going to do that for us. But because it's also bringing the volume down, we're getting a difference between what's in the middle and what's in the sides. So we're going to get a sense of width by the sheer fact that we're hearing more of the sides compared to the middle. So that's just a little bit about why we're using that. And this is so subtle. If you look at this needle right here, this gain reduction, remember, gain reduction tells us how much is being either compressed or limited. So, it's so little. Yeah. So it's like a dB, you know. It's so subtle, but in mastering, it definitely makes a difference. Let me bypass it. Let's hear if you can hear the difference. So here's on. Here's off. Listen to the vocal. On. Here's off. Honestly, I don't mind it without it. It's actually kind of cool, but there's a subtle volume difference. I actually kind of like it without it a little bit, but that's why the mix wet dry is here, because I could just do this. Yeah, I kind of like that. It actually, I hear the voice and the kick and just kind of like that middle section of the track, the middle, right? Kind of come out a little. It gets a little 3D. I kind of like it. So yeah, those subtleties, and just I'll kind of end with this. Those subtleties are not something that are going to make or break your project. Let's just understand that. We talked about a lot of detail today that does help with translation, right? We talked about those things in the beginning. That translation of the music to different playback systems is very important, and things like EQ is going to make that difference. Okay, but these subtleties, like the RL360 in mastering, like what I just demonstrated with the binaural stuff, that's detail that a lot of us only care about. I didn't tell the artist that I did that. If he's listening right now he knows. but it's not something that is going to make or break the success of the project or the sound of the project. On the mixing side, when we do that stuff, that's pretty cool. That's, I think, a different experience. But these details, right? This mid-side compressor, even to an extent, I would say, like, boosting this high end. The artist might say, "Hey, can you make it a little brighter?" But that's me and the artist. Like, the listeners don't care about that stuff. When you listen to a song, like, you're not listening for that stuff. And there's a lot of subpar stuff out there that does really well. So, for the sake of manipulating sound, for the sake of doing what's up here to get that sound that's up here, for the sake of making something sound as good as what you're listening to understand how to manipulate the sound that you're working on to make it sound like that other thing, right? Let's understand these things. Let's understand these details. Let's understand what the subtleties of compression and EQ and even the crazy binaural stuff does, saturation, all that, limiting, and let's get there together. So that is what I'm going to consider to be the end of the walkthrough, the breakdown. Any other questions, please feel free. Let's go ahead and I'm looking right now at the chat. I see a question. Yeah, yeah, so the subtlety you're saying of the compressor, absolutely. Yeah, and it's like, that's the other thing too. It's like wider, louder. Like, these are all sort of hot words that we always want to gravitate towards. Like, I got to make it wider, I got to make it louder, I got to make it punchier. But do you, right? Ask yourself, is that the best thing? Let me try it without doing that, or with a small amount of that. That mix wet dry on those plugins is a lifesaver. So, but I really appreciate everybody coming through, hanging out for the duration. Let's see I got one more comment here. Yeah, I mean, I love Ableton for many reasons. The more you watch these, the more you'll see why I love it. And I'm always happy to answer more questions for you. As always, you all can follow myself and Colormind on our handles. I'll show them at the end here, but at Barrie Music or at Colormind Music on Instagram. You can also DM us whenever you want. We try to answer as many questions as we can. We love talking to people about this stuff. So you can DM either of us with any questions you might have, and definitely follow us on there. If you haven't followed this channel already, being on the stream tonight, please do so. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the love and everything. I do have a website, markbarrymusic.com. You can check out the Colormind website as well at colormindmusic.com. Just a heads up, we have a really cool free product that is going to be available really soon. You are going to be able to download the same multi-tracks that I'm working with in this video, not this video, but in a video that we're going to give you. And you guys will be able to mix alongside with me, depending on the plugins you have, doesn't really matter, but you'll at least be able to work on the same multi-tracks that I'm working on mixing and mastering in this video. And that will help you hopefully just get a little bit better handle on the things that you love to do. So keep an eye out for that. We'll definitely be blasting things about that both on this channel and also on Instagram. So yeah, keep an eye out for that kind of stuff. I did show you the Artisan website, so if you want any more information about those coupon codes, hit us up on Instagram. So yeah, I appreciate everybody. Thank you so much for stopping by today, and I will see you next Monday, same time, same channel. I appreciate everybody. Take care. Have a good night.